Fresh data shows inflation right now is easing across the country.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics says price increases cooled slightly in April to 4.9% year over year. That's some good news. It is the 10th consecutive month that inflation has fallen. However, it's still a fair ways off from the Fed's target for inflation, which remains 2%.
That's right. Meanwhile, core inflation, which excludes volatile energy and food prices, ticked up 0.4% between March and April. Elsewhere, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Food prices fell slightly, energy prices increased 0.6%, and shelter prices rose 0.4%, which is a smaller increase than last month. Joining us now is Betsey Stevenson. She's a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. She's also the former chief economist for the Department of Labor and has some gorgeous flowers behind her. Betsey, thanks for joining us and for being so pleasant today. But break it down for us. What do these numbers mean? Are they in line with expectations? Is this good news? What's your view?
So these numbers were absolutely in line with expectations. And I think meeting expectations is always good because it means that, we're sort of seeing what we expect to see. Some of this is because we can predict some things. Like we had already seen other data suggesting that used car prices had been pretty high in the past month. And that came in as something that contributed to higher inflation, high used car prices. But we have new data from recent auctions that suggest that's kind of a one-off blip, and those used car prices are probably going to come down in a few months. The big ticket item in our CPI is our housing data and what's happening to housing prices. Most people realize it's about a third of their budget. That's how we measure it as well. It's about a third of how we measure it, of contributing to inflation. And in housing and shelter and rent prices, they're continuing to rise, but less quickly than they were before. So that overall number, inflation rate, is starting to come down. But it takes a while to percolate through because, imagine you've been in a lease for 2 years and now it's time to renew it. Your landlord's probably going to say, hey, prices have increased. I need to raise your rent a little bit. So that's why it takes a little bit of time to go through. But we are seeing evidence that that's coming to an end. So brand new leases are not coming in much hotter than what somebody was paying, say, a month ago to get a new lease. And we're also seeing home prices are kind of starting to flatline. So we saw a big run up in home prices in the wake of the pandemic. And those high interest rates are starting to bite. That comes into inflation in what we call owner equivalent rent. I think it's confusing for a lot of everyday people because most people like to see the value of their house going up. But that, of course, means higher inflation. And that's because the people who want to buy houses don't like to see the price of your house going up.
So on that note, Betsey, if you mentioned that the prices of homes have sort of flatlined, that the price of used cars are starting to come down. If people need to make any of these big purchases, what is your recommendation? What are you projecting, particularly for housing costs going forward?
Well, what we're looking at is what can we predict in terms of what's going to be coming through the data because we sort of know that's happening. What the big issue in our housing market is an issue of supply. We just don't have enough houses. If we want to bring the cost of housing down, the way to do that is build more houses, build more apartments. So my advice to somebody is right now we're seeing a lot of new multi-unit apartments coming into a lot of markets. It's obviously going to depend on where you live in the country, but if there's a lot of new building happening, then you're going to see prices starting to come down because there's going to be a lot of availability. I think in general, when it comes time to buying a home, it's really hard to time the market. And my best advice to people is to really think about, is this a good time for you in your personal life? And how likely are you to need to sell that house in the next couple of years? Because if you think you might need to move, it's not a good time to buy, regardless of what's happening in the market.
All right. Lots of helpful advice for our viewers. Betsey Stevenson, thank you.
Thanks, Betsey.